Welcome to a story that blurs the line between legend and nightmare. Deep beneath the glittering lights of New York City lies a labyrinth of tunnels shrouded in mystery and fear. When whispers began circulating about P. Diddy's secret subterranean world, it seemed like just another urban myth. But recent discoveries have unearthed chilling truths about these underground corridors, revealing a side of fame and fortune darker than anyone could have imagined. Brace yourself. This story is not for the faint of heart. It began as a typical outing for a group of urban explorers, just another adventure into the forgotten spaces beneath New York City. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and an insatiable thirst for discovery, they descended into a dilapidated subway station that had been closed off for decades. The air was thick with dust, and the echo of their footsteps seemed louder than it should have been, as though the tunnels themselves were amplifying every sound. The group had explored many abandoned places before, but something about this location felt different. The graffiti on the walls wasn't the usual mix of colorful tags and crude sketches. It was darker, more deliberate. Strange symbols that looked like they belonged in an ancient text were etched in red paint, with arrows pointing deeper into the tunnels. One of the explorers, a woman named Mia, hesitated. "Doesn't this feel off to you guys?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The others brushed it off, eager to see what lay ahead. The tunnel stretched on for what felt like miles. The further they walked, the more the environment began to change. The standard concrete walls of the subway gave way to something much older. The bricks looked ancient, worn smooth by time, and the faint remnants of carvings could be seen beneath layers of grime. It was clear they were no longer in a simple subway system. Then they found it, the door. It stood out against the tunnel wall, a massive slab of metal that looked impossibly modern compared to its surroundings. The emblem on the door was unmistakable. A sleek logo resembling a crown, a symbol anyone who followed pop culture would recognize as P. Diddy's signature. The group exchanged nervous glances. What was his logo doing down here? And why had no one ever mentioned anything like this before? Trevor, the unofficial leader of the group, stepped forward. "It's probably just some weird marketing stunt," he said, trying to sound confident. "Like maybe a secret music venue or something." "Underground," Mia muttered, her sarcasm failing to hide her unease. "Very literal." The door was slightly ajar, as if someone had left it open intentionally. Pushing it open revealed a narrow staircase spiraling downward, the air growing colder with each step. The walls were lined with faintly glowing strips of light, casting a ghostly blue hue over everything. Whoever had designed this space wanted it to feel futuristic, and it did, but there was an undeniable eeriness that clung to the air like a fog. At the bottom of the staircase, the tunnel expanded into a vast corridor. The ceiling arched high above them, adorned with more of those strange symbols they had seen earlier. But these were larger, more elaborate, and they pulsed faintly, as if alive. Trevor took out his phone to snap a picture, but the screen went black. So did everyone else's devices. "Okay, that's not creepy at all," muttered Jake, another member of the group, as he slapped his phone in frustration. They pressed on, their flashlights providing the only illumination now. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, but soon they noticed small alcoves carved into the walls. Each alcove contained peculiar items: a broken turntable, a microphone coated in dust, an old champagne flute with dried residue at the bottom. These weren't just random objects, they were relics of another world, one far removed from the grime and darkness of these tunnels. "Look at this," Mia said, pointing to a framed photograph leaning against one of the alcoves. It was a candid shot of Diddy, smiling at the camera, a crowd of glamorous partygoers blurred in the background. But the longer they looked at the photo, the more unsettling it became. There was something wrong with the faces in the crowd. Their smiles were too wide, their eyes too hollow. One figure in the corner seemed to be staring directly at the camera, their gaze piercing and impossibly focused, as if they were looking at the explorers themselves. A chill ran through the group. "Let's keep moving," Trevor said, though his voice wavered. He hated to admit it, but he was starting to feel the same unease Mia had expressed earlier. It wasn't just the strangeness of the place, it was the sensation that they were being watched. The corridor eventually led to a massive open space. At first glance, it resembled a ballroom, with a polished floor that reflected the beams of their flashlights. But the decorations were all wrong. The walls were lined with black curtains, and strange artifacts were placed on pedestals around the room. One pedestal held what looked like an ornate mask, its surface covered in intricate carvings. Another displayed a gold chalice filled with a dark, viscous liquid that seemed to ripple despite no one touching it. "What is this place?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible. As they explored the room, Mia spotted something in the corner. A door, smaller and less grand than the one they had entered through, but no less intriguing. Unlike the first door, this one was locked. She crouched down to examine it and noticed a faint hum emanating from the other side. It wasn't mechanical. It was more like the sound of distant voices, speaking a language she couldn't understand. Trevor approached the door, pressing his ear against it. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his face pale. No one responded. The air had grown colder, and the room felt darker, as if the shadows themselves were closing in. For the first time, Trevor considered turning back, but before he could voice the thought, the faint hum from behind the door grew louder, transforming into a low, guttural growl. Something slammed against the door from the other side. The group bolted, running back the way they had come. But the corridor didn't look the same anymore. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, pulsating in a rhythm that matched the pounding of their hearts. The alcoves were empty now, their relics gone as though they had never been there. When they finally reached the staircase and scrambled back to the surface, the group was silent. No one wanted to speak about what they had seen or heard, but deep down, they all knew the truth. They had stumbled onto something they were never meant to find, and it wasn't over, not yet. The tunnels stretched on in an endless maze, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. The group couldn't shake the feeling that the air grew thicker with every step they took. The walls seemed alive, radiating a low hum that vibrated through their bodies. It wasn't until they turned a corner that they stumbled upon the first true anomaly. It was a room, but not like anything they had encountered before. The doorway was arched, the frame etched with the same strange symbols they had seen earlier, but now they were more vivid. Trevor led the way, cautiously stepping inside, his flashlight beam sweeping over the space. It was as if they had entered a forgotten museum. The room was massive, its walls lined with shelves containing objects that seemed out of place. There were no labels, no explanations for what these things were or why they were here. On one shelf sat a vintage record player, its needle suspended mid-air as if someone had stopped it mid-song. On another was an old rotary telephone, its cord frayed and tangled, yet faintly vibrating, as though it were ringing in complete silence. In the center of the room stood a pedestal holding a large, ornate box. The box was intricately carved, its surface covered in symbols that none of them recognized. The carvings seemed to shimmer, catching the light in ways that made it difficult to focus on them for too long. Mia stepped closer, her curiosity overpowering her fear. "Don't touch it," Trevor said sharply, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. She pulled her hand back, but didn't move away. Jake, who had been silent for most of the journey, spoke up. "This is starting to feel like some kind of collection," he said, gesturing toward the shelves. "But who would build this down here, and why?" The group exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear this wasn't just an abandoned tunnel or a hidden part of the subway system. This was deliberate, crafted with a purpose they couldn't yet comprehend. As they explored further, they noticed something even more disturbing. In the corners of the room were mannequins, or at least that's what they looked like at first glance. Their bodies were pale and featureless, their limbs unnaturally long and thin. Each one was positioned as though frozen in mid-motion, some reaching toward the shelves, others seemingly caught in the act of walking. Their lack of detail made them more unsettling, their blank faces reflecting the beams of the flashlights. Mia turned to speak, but froze. One of the mannequins had moved, or at least it appeared to have. She was sure it had been standing upright before, but now it was slumped slightly forward, its head tilted as if watching her. "Guys," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Did that just—" Before she could finish, Jake interrupted. "Over here. You need to see this." The group hurried to where Jake was standing, his flashlight focused on a section of the wall. At first, it looked like an ordinary part of the room, but upon closer inspection, they saw that the bricks were uneven, as though something had been hastily sealed behind them. Carved into the bricks were more symbols, but these were different, sharper, more violent, as if they had been scratched into the surface rather than carefully etched. Trevor reached out and pressed against the wall. It didn't budge, but the moment he made contact, a low rumbling sound filled the room. The shelves rattled and the mannequins shifted ever so slightly. The sound grew louder, more guttural, like the growl of some immense creature buried deep below them. "Let's go," Mia said, backing toward the doorway. "I'm serious. We shouldn't be here." But Trevor wasn't ready to leave. His curiosity, mixed with an underlying sense of dread, kept him rooted to the spot. "There's something behind this wall," he said. "I can feel it." Before anyone could argue, the rumbling stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The room fell deathly silent, the only sound the faint hum of the walls. But the silence was worse somehow, oppressive and unnatural. It pressed down on them, making it hard to breathe. Jake shined his flashlight back toward the mannequins and swore under his breath. "They're closer," he said, his voice shaking. "I swear to God, they're closer." The others turned to look, and sure enough, the mannequins were no longer confined to the corners of the room. They had shifted, subtly but undeniably, their featureless heads now angled toward the group. Trevor stepped back, his bravado faltering. "Okay," he said quietly. "Maybe we should—" He was cut off by a sharp metallic scraping sound. It echoed through the room, reverberating off the walls. The group whipped around, their flashlights darting frantically. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then they saw it. A small crack had appeared in the sealed wall. a thin line of light seeping through. The light wasn't natural. It was cold and blue, the same hue as the glowing symbols that had led them here. The group stared, transfixed, as the crack widened ever so slightly. Jake took a step back. Nope. Nope. I'm done, he said, his voice rising in panic. We're leaving. Now. This time, no one argued. They turned and ran, their footsteps echoing wildly as they scrambled out of the room. But the corridors weren't the same anymore. The path they had taken was gone, replaced by new twists and turns that shouldn't have been there. It was as if the tunnels were shifting, rearranging themselves to trap them. The hum of the walls grew louder, almost deafening. The symbols glowed brighter, pulsing in time with the frantic beating of their hearts. Trevor led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. But no matter which direction they turned, the tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of them. Just when they thought they would never escape, they saw it. The staircase. Relief flooded over them as they sprinted toward it, climbing the steps 2 at a time. The moment they emerged into the open air, the hum stopped. The oppressive silence was replaced by the distant sounds of the city above. They stood there for a moment, gasping for breath, too shaken to speak. But as they glanced back at the entrance to the tunnels, they noticed something that sent a new wave of fear crashing over them. The door they had entered through was no longer there. In its place was a solid brick wall, as if the entrance had never existed. The group didn't talk much after they escaped the tunnels. Each of them seemed lost in their own thoughts, grappling with the unexplainable horrors they had encountered. Trevor, usually the most vocal and enthusiastic, sat in the corner of Mia's apartment, staring at the floor while nervously tapping his foot. Mia paced back and forth, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Jake sat on the couch, flipping through his phone, even though it had barely worked since they'd entered the tunnels. His hands trembled as he swiped through the photos he'd taken earlier, each one more unsettling than the last. But it was what they'd brought back with them that loomed largest in their minds: the tapes. When they had fled the underground labyrinth, Mia had grabbed a small box from one of the shelves. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, driven more by adrenaline than logic, but now the box sat ominously on the table in front of them. Inside were several VHS tapes, each one labeled with a simple date written in faded ink. The dates ranged from the early 1990s to as recent as 2 years ago. There were no other markings, no explanations of what might be on them. "I'm telling you, we shouldn't even touch those," Jake muttered, breaking the silence. "We should take them to the cops or, I don't know, burn them." "And tell the cops what?" Trevor snapped. "That we found some creepy tapes in a tunnel with mannequins that move on their own? Yeah, that'll go over real well." Mia stopped pacing and turned to face them. "We need to know what's on them. What if they explain what's going on down there? What if they tell us how to stop it?" Jake shook his head. "What if watching them makes everything worse?" Despite his protests, the group eventually agreed to watch the tapes. Trevor set up an old VHS player he'd found in the back of a closet, and they inserted the first tape. The screen flickered to life with a burst of static, followed by shaky, grainy footage. At first, it was hard to make out anything. The camera seemed to be moving through a crowded space, the images blurred and disjointed. Then the picture stabilized, revealing what appeared to be a lavish underground party. The camera panned over a crowd of people dressed in extravagant outfits, their faces obscured by ornate masks. It was an opulent scene, with tables piled high with food and drinks, chandeliers casting a dim, golden glow over the room. A familiar figure appeared on screen. Diddy, unmistakable even behind his mask, moving through the crowd with an air of authority. At first glance, it looked like a typical high society event, albeit in an unusual location. But the longer they watched, the more unsettling the footage became. The partygoers' movements were strange, jerky, almost mechanical, and their laughter sounded hollow, like it was being played on a loop. In the background, faint music played, a haunting melody that seemed to seep into the room where the group was sitting. Mia leaned closer to the screen. "Look at their hands," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The camera had zoomed in on a table where several guests were playing a card game. Their hands were unnaturally pale, the veins beneath their skin dark and pronounced. One guest dropped a card, and as they bent to pick it up, their head turned unnaturally far to the side, revealing eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. "What the hell is this?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. Trevor fast-forwarded the tape, skipping past several minutes of footage. The scene changed abruptly. The camera was now in a different part of the tunnels, filming what appeared to be a ritual. A group of masked figures stood in a circle, chanting in a language none of them recognized. In the center of the circle was a pedestal holding a large black object wrapped in cloth. As the chanting grew louder, the figures began to sway in unison, their movements becoming more erratic. Then the camera shifted, as if the person filming had turned to look at something else. In the corner of the frame, a shadow moved, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongating as it crept closer to the group. The shadow seemed to ripple like smoke given form, and for a brief moment it turned toward the camera. Two glowing eyes stared directly into the lens. The screen went black. No one spoke for several moments. The room felt colder, as though the air itself had been drained of warmth. Mia was the first to break the silence. "There's more," she said, her voice trembling. "We have to see the rest." Trevor hesitated, his hand hovering over the stack of tapes. "Are you sure about that? We already know enough to stay the hell away from those tunnels." "But what if this explains why it's all happening?" Mia pressed. "What if this is our only chance to figure it out?" Reluctantly, Trevor inserted the next tape. This one began with more static, followed by footage of an empty room. The camera was stationary, positioned in the corner of the space, and for a moment it seemed like nothing was happening. Then a figure entered the frame. Diddy, his mask gone, his face expressionless. He approached a table in the center of the room, where another figure was seated. The seated figure's head was lowered, their hands bound behind their back. Diddy spoke, his voice low and calm, but the words were unintelligible. He placed something on the table, a small, glowing orb that pulsed faintly with blue light. As he spoke, the orb's glow intensified, casting eerie shadows across the room. The bound figure began to convulse, their body writhing in unnatural ways. Their head snapped back, their mouth opening in a silent scream. The orb's light seemed to pour into them, seeping into their skin until they collapsed, motionless. The tape ended abruptly, leaving the group in stunned silence. Trevor turned off the TV and sat back, rubbing his temples. "This isn't just some weird party or cult," he said finally. "This is something else." "What do we do now?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible. Mia stared at the blank screen, her mind racing. She didn't have an answer, But one thing was clear. Whatever they had uncovered, it was far bigger and far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. And now it was impossible to ignore the feeling that they were being watched. The paranoia set in almost immediately after they finished watching the tapes. None of them could shake the feeling that they had invited something into their lives, something they couldn't see but could sense, hovering just beyond the edges of perception. Mia locked her apartment door and closed all the curtains, but it didn't help. Every noise outside, a car passing, footsteps in the hallway, felt like a potential threat. The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning. Jake didn't show up at their agreed meeting spot, a diner a few blocks from Mia's place. They had planned to regroup and figure out what to do next. But as the minutes ticked by, it became clear he wasn't coming. Trevor tried calling him, but the call went straight to voicemail. Mia texted, her fingers trembling as she typed, but there was no response. Worried, the two decided to head to Jake's apartment. When they arrived, the door was locked and the windows were dark. Trevor knocked loudly, his fists pounding against the wood, but there was no answer. "Jake!" Mia shouted. "Come on! It's us! Open the door!" After several minutes of silence, Trevor tried the landlord, who begrudgingly unlocked the door after they explained their fears. The apartment was eerily quiet, the air heavy with a faint metallic smell that made Mia's stomach churn. The living room was undisturbed, but as they ventured deeper into the apartment, they noticed odd details. A half-finished plate of food sat on the kitchen counter, the fork lying in a pool of cold sauce. Jake's phone was on the table, its screen cracked but still lit up, showing a single unfinished text message. "It's here. Don't..." Mia gasped as she read it. "Don't what?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Trevor moved toward the bedroom, pushing the door open slowly. The room was empty, but the bed was a mess of crumpled sheets and overturned pillows. The closet door was ajar, revealing nothing but darkness. Trevor stepped closer, his flashlight cutting through the shadows, but there was no sign of Jake. It was as if he had simply vanished. Mia grabbed his arm. "We need to go," she said, her voice urgent. "Now." Back at Mia's apartment, the tension was palpable. Neither of them spoke much, the weight of Jake's disappearance hanging heavily in the air. Trevor sat by the window, peering out through the closed curtains, while Mia paced the room, her mind racing. "What if this is our fault?" she said suddenly. "What if those tapes, what if watching them did something, opened some kind of door?" Trevor shook his head, but he didn't seem convinced. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever's happening, it's not normal." That night, the fear escalated. Around midnight, Mia's phone buzzed with a message. She grabbed it quickly, her heart racing. The message was from an unknown number, and it contained only 3 words. "You saw it." She stared at the screen, her breath catching in her throat. Before she could say anything, Trevor's phone buzzed too. He pulled it out and frowned, his face going pale. "I got the same message," he said, showing her the screen. They both looked at each other, the unspoken dread growing between them. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed through the apartment. Mia froze, her eyes darting to the door. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a low, rasping voice. "We know you're in there." Trevor motioned for Mia to stay quiet, grabbing a kitchen knife as he crept toward the door. He peered through the peephole, but there was no one there. Just as he turned to say something, the knocking moved, this time to the window. Mia gasped, clutching her chest. They were 3 stories up, Trevor pulled the curtains back slightly and his face went white. "Oh my God," he whispered. Outside, hovering just beyond the glass, was a figure. Its body was indistinct, a swirling mass of shadow and smoke, but its eyes burned with a faint bluish light. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, as if the air in the room had been sucked out. Mia grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the window. "What is it? What did you see?" He couldn't answer. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The figure outside began to press against the glass, the surface bowing inward as though it were made of something pliable. Cracks started to form, spiderwebbing across the pane. "We need to leave," Mia shouted, grabbing her keys and pulling Trevor toward the door. They bolted out of the apartment, not daring to look back. The hallway was empty, but the oppressive feeling of being watched followed them as they raced down the stairs and out into the street. The city, usually bustling even at night, felt desolate. The streetlights flickered, and the few people they passed seemed to blur, their faces indistinct. Mia and Trevor jumped into his car, locking the doors as soon as they were inside. "Where do we go?" Mia asked, her voice frantic. Trevor hesitated. "Someplace far away from here, somewhere it can't find us." As he started the engine, his phone buzzed again. He didn't want to look, but his eyes were drawn to the screen. The message was different this time. "You can't run." Mia's phone buzzed too, the same message appearing on her screen. She stared at it, her hands shaking. What does it want from us? Trevor didn't answer. He put the car in drive and sped off into the night, the city lights blurring past. But no matter how far they drove, the feeling of being watched never left them. The road stretched out before them, dark and empty, as Trevor's car tore through the city and into the surrounding suburbs. The distant hum of streetlights faded as they entered the countryside, replaced by an eerie silence that only amplified their fear. Mia kept looking over her shoulder, expecting to see the shadowy figure following them, but the road behind remained empty. Still, she couldn't shake the sensation that they were being pursued. "Where are we even going?" Mia asked, her voice tinged with desperation. "I don't know," Trevor admitted. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel. "As far away as we can get. Somewhere they can't find us." "Who's they?" Mia snapped, her frustration bubbling over. "What are we even running from? That thing, Diddy, the tunnels, all of it." Trevor didn't answer, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Hours passed, and they eventually found themselves in a remote area, surrounded by dense forests. Trevor pulled the car onto an overgrown dirt road and stopped. He turned off the engine, leaving them in complete darkness, save for the faint glow of the moon filtering through the trees. "This should buy us some time," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. Mia leaned her head against the window, trying to steady her breathing. Her mind raced with everything they had seen, the tunnels, the mannequins, the tapes, and now this thing that seemed to be hunting them. It felt like they had stepped into a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. She flinched, the sound slicing through the silence like a knife. Trevor's phone buzzed too. They exchanged a look, neither wanting to check their screens, but knowing they had to. The messages were identical. "Come back." "What the hell does that mean?" Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. Trevor stared at the screen, his jaw clenched. "It's the tunnels. It wants us to go back." "No way," Mia said, shaking her head. "We barely made it out alive. I'm not going back there. Trevor looked out of the window, his expression grim. What if it doesn't stop until we do? Jake's gone, Mia. Whatever this thing is, it's not going to let us walk away. Mia opened her mouth to argue, but the words caught in her throat. Deep down, she knew he was right. Whatever force was tied to the tunnels, it wasn't going to let them go so easily. Before they could discuss it further, a sharp knock echoed through the car. They both jumped, their heads snapping toward the sound. It had come from the rear window, but when they looked, there was nothing there. Just the dark expanse of the forest. Drive, Mia hissed. Trevor, get us out of here. Trevor fumbled with the keys, starting the engine. The headlights illuminated the dirt road ahead, but as the car began to move, something stepped into the light. It wasn't human. Its form was tall and spindly, its limbs impossibly long and thin. Its body seemed to shift and ripple like smoke, and its eyes glowed with that same faint blue light they had seen in the tapes. It stood motionless in the middle of the road, blocking their path. Go around it, Mia screamed. Trevor swerved, narrowly avoiding the figure. The car jolted as it veered off the road and into the trees, branches scraping against the windows like claws. The figure didn't follow, but as they sped away, the oppressive feeling of being watched grew stronger. After several miles of driving blindly through the forest, they came to a clearing and stopped. Trevor killed the engine again, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Mia was shaking, her hands gripping the dashboard. We can't keep running, she said finally, her voice trembling. It's not going to stop. We have to end this. Trevor turned to her, his eyes filled with fear. And how do we do that? By going back to the place where it all started. That's exactly what it wants. Maybe that's the only way to make it stop, Mia said. We need to face it. Find out what it wants. Destroy it, if we can. Trevor hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. If we do this, we do it together. No splitting up, no stupid risks. Agreed, Mia said, though the fear in her eyes betrayed her bravado. The drive back to the city felt surreal, as if they were willingly walking into their own graves. The streets were eerily quiet when they arrived, the usual chaos of New York replaced by an unnatural stillness. They parked near the entrance to the abandoned subway station and sat in the car for a long moment, neither of them wanting to move. This is insane, Trevor muttered. We shouldn't be here. We don't have a choice, Mia said, gripping the door handle. Let's finish this. They climbed out of the car and approached the station. The entrance was just as they had left it, sealed with a brick wall. But as they stepped closer, the bricks began to crumble, as if responding to their presence. Within seconds, the doorway was open again, leading into the dark abyss. Mia turned on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. Trevor followed, his knife clutched tightly in his hand. The air grew colder with each step, and the hum they had heard before returned, louder this time, vibrating through their bodies. The tunnels twisted and turned, but they seemed to know exactly where to go, as if something was guiding them. When they reached the large open room where it had all started, they stopped. The room looked different now, darker, more menacing. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, pulsing in time with their racing hearts. In the center of the room stood the figure. It was larger now, its form more defined but no less terrifying. Its glowing eyes locked onto them, and the room seemed to close in, the walls warping and shifting. Mia stepped forward, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice echoing in the empty space. "Why are you doing this?" The figure didn't respond, but the hum grew louder, morphing into a deep, guttural sound that shook the ground beneath them. The pedestal in the center of the room began to glow, and the black cloth that had once covered the object fell away, revealing a pulsating orb, the same one they had seen in the tapes. Trevor grabbed Mia's arm. "We need to destroy it," he said. "That's the source." Without hesitation, Mia ran toward the pedestal, her flashlight clattering to the ground as she reached for the orb. The figure moved, its shadowy form stretching toward her like tendrils of smoke. Trevor lunged forward, slashing at the tendrils with his knife, but it was like cutting through air. Mia grabbed the orb, its surface searing her hands with a cold, burning pain. She screamed, but held on, lifting it above her head. The room began to shake violently, the walls cracking as the symbols pulsed faster and faster. "Do it!" Trevor shouted. "Smash it!" With all her strength, Mia hurled the orb to the ground. It shattered with an ear-splitting crack, releasing a blinding light that engulfed the room. The figure let out a deafening roar, its form dissolving into the light. The walls crumbled and the ground gave way beneath them. When Mia and Trevor woke up, they were outside, lying on the cold pavement near the subway entrance. The tunnels were gone, replaced by a solid wall of brick and concrete. The oppressive hum was gone, replaced by the distant sounds of the city returning to life. They sat up, their bodies aching, but they were alive. For the first time in days, the feeling of being watched was gone. "It's over," Mia said, her voice shaky but filled with relief. Trevor nodded, though he knew neither of them would ever truly forget what they had seen. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed.